Welcome to Litcast, the podcast covering literature notes and revision for WJEC. These podcasts are designed to be used as an additional revision tool. There's nothing new or groundbreaking here, just revision notes in an on-the-go friendly format. Using these alone won't guarantee you an A star, but they can help you build your confidence to apply this knowledge to your exam questions and your classwork. With that being said, let's get started.
And welcome to Litcast and to the first Litcast episode on An Inspector Calls. In this episode we'll be talking about Mrs. Birling and her importance in the play. Mrs. Birling is the wife of Mr. Birling and the mother of Sheila and Eric, and she is presented as a snobbish and narrow-minded character who is very concerned with social class, with social standing, and with the image and reputation of her family. At the start of the play, she's described as a rather cold woman, suggesting a lack of affection even around her family, even when she's with her husband and her children and celebrating her daughter's engagement. She's also described as her husband's social superior, so there's a focus on social class right from the very start of the play. She looks down on anyone who is of a lower social class than she is. Even her own husband, towards the beginning of the play, she tells him off. She reproaches him for complimenting the cook. She says, "Arthur, you're not supposed to say such things," when he compliments the cook. Because according to the rules of social etiquette, it should be for the guest to compliment the cook. And so, it shows that she has to remind him about those rules. She has to, or she sees herself as having to kind of pull him up to being better, as she would see it, to behaving in a more socially appropriate way. She's also a very traditional and a very old-fashioned character. We see this when she says to Sheila about Gerald, when Sheila is complaining that Gerald had to spend time at his work all through the previous summer, and she says, "When you're married, you'll realise that men with important work to do sometimes have to spend nearly all their time and energy on their business." She's really kind of more interested here in maintaining those traditional gender roles and passing those roles down to her daughter. She's more interested in that than she is in her own daughter's happiness in her marriage. Mrs. Birling is off stage for much of the inspector's arrival and for much of his questioning in Act 1 and Act 2. And when she returns to the stage in Act 2, she comes back very confidently and is very dismissive immediately of the inspector's questioning and his investigation. She calls it absurd, and she criticises his peculiar and offensive manner. So like her husband, she feels that her family should be exempt from this investigation, that they are above the law due to their social status. Mrs. Birling only really sees what she wants to see when it comes to her own family. We see this when she refuses to believe that Eric drinks too much. When Sheila tells them that Eric has been drinking too much for years, she's staggered and she says, "It isn't true." And she even turns to Gerald and says, "You know him, Gerald." She refuses to believe that her son could behave in this way. And similarly, she's blind to the actions of Alderman Magatti, or Old Joe Magatti. She finds it impossible to believe that a man in a position of authority, a man who is, of a respectable social status, could behave in the way that Sheila is describing, when he's being described as a womanizer. So Mrs. Birling actually believes that their social class, the family's social class, and the social class of the people they know in society, that makes them morally superior, that makes them somehow better than people who are of a lower social status. And this is seen all the way through the play. She looks down on girls of that class. That's how she refers to girls like Eva Smith. And she also talks about Eva as a girl of that sort. She says, as if a girl of that sort would ever refuse money. So this suggests that she sees the working class as this sort of homogenous group who must all behave the same way, who must all be morally inferior, who must all be greedy or criminal or in some way inferior to her in a moral sense. So these attitudes that she has towards the working class, towards girls of that class, are all the more shocking and seem all the more cruel given Mrs. Birling's position as head of the Bromley Women's Charity Organisation. She should be someone that girls like Eva can go to for help. But she not only refuses to help Eva, but she actually convinces the other women in the charity to turn Eva away too. Mrs. Birling's cruelty and her complete disregard for the feelings of anyone else are seen when she sends Eva away, and also in the way she says, "I accept no blame," even though she's turned this girl away from her charitable organisation. She accepts no responsibility for what happens to her next, and instead she starts to blame the father of Eva's unborn child. She tells the inspector to go and look for the father of the child. It's his responsibility. And she also says that the father of the child ought to be dealt with very severely. Now this just shows Mrs. Birling's hypocrisy, because at this point she doesn't know that she's talking about her own son, and as soon as she does, she's horrified. She is happy to place blame on other people, but not when it comes to her own family. Out of all the characters in the play, Mrs. Birling is the most reluctant to change, the most reluctant to accept any responsibility. She's the most unwilling to show any remorse. And she's the most resistant to Inspector Gould's and Maypole Priestley's message. She actually prides herself on being the only one not to give in to the inspector. Priestley uses Mrs. Birling there to show a character who refuses to accept her own part in what has happened, refuses to change. And he uses her to show the ignorance, the selfishness, and the corruption of the wealthier, privileged classes. Her refusal to take any responsibility for what's happened or to change her ways marks her out as a member of the kind of old-fashioned and static class of people that Priestley wanted his audience to despise. And he shows her to be someone who really has no place in the sort of socialist society that he envisions.
The music used in this podcast is by Ixon. You can find these and all the other amazing tracks that he does on SoundCloud.